Thank you everyone for joining tonight's talk. For those who've never been before, this is the Edinburgh Fortean Society, and we normally meet on the second Tuesday of every month in real life. Obviously, for the current situation, we're meeting online, and you know, I think we're probably going to be doing that until the end of the year, realistically. And then when we meet in real life, as soon as is safely practicable, we will then try and make sure we still keep some web presence like this, because I know some people have found it very, very enjoying and wishing to. Oh, there was an orb just there. Wishing to continue it, so I'm wishing to capitalize on that. So not quite sure what form that's going to take, but we'll do something somehow to ensure that we have some form of continuity. For those who don't know me, my name is Gordon Rutter, and I'm the person who organises these talks. And as I say, we normally meet at 7:30 on the second Tuesday of every month in a local pub, and we have a chat, talk, usually with the Q&A session as well. And as part of that, we also have a bit of social time as well. So we have a room booked in a pub, private room with full projection facilities and all those sorts of things. So tonight we have a speaker who we've never had at the Edinburgh Fortean Society. That's another thing that the current times have allowed us to do. We've been using it to get speakers who, under normal circumstances, might not be able to get to us because of geography or whatever. So I was very pleased when our speaker for this evening agreed to do the talk. I've known him for a number of years, and we were trying to work out when the last time we saw each other was. It was quite a few years ago, but yeah, neither of us can quite remember. And
we'll say we've known each other for decades. I think that covers it.
That covers it, definitely. Yeah, he's definitely a name that you've all heard, and he's a very, very prominent figure in the world of Fortean and the supernatural. He's written a number of books: In Search of the Supernatural, Ghost Hunters, Science and Seance, and he works now as head of department in psychology at the Bucks New University, and he's got an online parapsychology course which you can join, and he's got a new book coming out sometime in the near future, and he'll be telling us about that this evening as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ciaran O'Keeffe will now be talking on exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. Thank you very much, Ciaran.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gordon, and the Society for having me. Very, very grateful, and lovely that I can speak to you all this evening. So, exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. Well, for those of you that don't know, my official kind of academic role is as a parapsychologist. I have a number of different hats. I do work in forensic psychology as well as a bit of music psychology as well. But mainly my research and my passion is in parapsychology. So I'm going to talk to you about this particular area, haunting reality, paranormal encounters, but to give it a context and to make sure that you understand where I'm coming from. What I want to do is define what parapsychology is. Generally, we talk about it being the scientific study of the paranormal, which covers three main areas: extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and then a third area, which is after-death communication, or sometimes referred to as survival. Now, extrasensory perception is three alleged abilities: telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance. Telepathy being mind-to-mind communication. Precognition is predicting the future. Clairvoyance is really seeing without your eyes, effectively. Some of you may have heard the term clairvoyance in relation to mediumship and actually seeing the spirit. Clairvoyance in a parapsychology context is seeing without using your eyes. So a good example of that would be if you did a drawing and put it in an envelope and asked me to work it out, or to work out what the drawing was using some paranormal ability, I might use clairvoyance to see the picture in the envelope. If I'm accurate, then is it an example of clairvoyance, or did I get the drawing from your head, which would be telepathy, or did I have a dream about the drawing a few nights before, and then when you asked me about the drawing, I suddenly remembered the dream, and therefore it's an example of precognition. And that's a way of illustrating why we call those three abilities ESP, or extrasensory perception, because sometimes it's difficult to disentangle the three of them. The second area of study for parapsychologists is psychokinesis, the ability of the mind to manipulate objects. The best example of that we probably all know is Uri Geller's spoon bending. And as a little aside, some of you might know me from the show Most Haunted. The first time I was involved in that show was when Most Haunted did a filming from the Black Swan in Devizes in Wiltshire, and Uri Geller was a guest, and I jumped at the chance to join the team because Uri Geller features quite strongly in the history of parapsychology, and I relished the opportunity to meet him. When I did meet him, he had been at the venue for about an hour. Somebody walked up to him and asked him to bend a spoon, and he said, "No, I don't want to bend a spoon. I am here to investigate this haunted location. I'm here to work with the Most Haunted team and to look for ghosts and look for evidence of ghosts. I don't want to be known as the man that just bends spoons." And I was thinking, it's a bit late now because that's all you really do. And I should know because over the course of about 3 hours, he bent a spoon for anybody and everybody that asked him, including myself. And I've got a lovely signed copy of one of his bent spoons in my office. But that's psychokinesis, and that is an example of what we call macro psychokinesis. We can see PK, or the psychokinesis, with our eyes. We can actually see it. Another example in a haunting context would be if you've ever watched paranormal television or been on a ghost hunt and you've seen people standing around a table willing the spirit to move the table. So either to levitate it or tip it or turn it. In some areas, people call that table phenomena. That's a very spiritualism expression. In parapsychology, there are some parapsychologists that feel it might be an example of group PK. Again, it's macro PK. We can see it happening. But is it actually the spirit causing the table to move, or is it the group around the table kind of willing it to move? So almost a form of PK. Conversely, instead of macro PK, you have micro PK, which is PK you can't strictly see. So you need some sort of monitoring equipment to be able to pick up on the alteration or the manipulation. An example would be in Princeton, I think in the late 80s there was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, Robert Yarn and Brenda Dunn, who did some research about PK, and one of the micro PK examples was trying to get people to affect the decay of radioactive material. You can't see it, but you need some sort of equipment to be able to measure that decay is being affected. Similarly, Serena Roney Dougal's research in Glastonbury, looking at the ability of healers to affect the growth, or to help improve actually the growth of distressed lettuce seeds. Again, you can't see it. If you sit in front of it, you can't see it happening. If you had a time-lapse camera, you could potentially see the growth of lettuce seeds of those that the healers affected versus a control group, so you could see the difference there. Or if you had some way of measuring the difference between the two groups, you could do that. But it's micro, you can't see it happening, but you can find ways of assessing it or measuring it. So I mentioned that difference, psychokinesis, macro PK, because it's important in terms of just mentioning very briefly poltergeist phenomena. This idea of a mischievous or noisy ghost, phenomena reported such as loud knocks, objects moving, levitation, spontaneous floods, electrical disturbances, things go missing, apports and asports, that sort of thing. It's kind of poltergeist phenomena. And some parapsychologists, I would say maybe more so in the past, have regarded poltergeist phenomena as being an example of PK. Recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis is the actual term that's used, and that's often accredited to a parapsychologist called William Roll. There are lots of precursors to that, so even though he's known for it, there are other researchers before it. Certainly earlier on in my career in parapsychology, I would buy into that theory as poltergeist phenomena being caused by a person, either consciously or subconsciously, PK. Now, well, because of some research into poltergeist phenomena, but also because of classic texts like Alan Gould and Tony Cornell's book on poltergeists, you can see that maybe it's dangerous almost to have to make a clear distinction between hauntings and poltergeist phenomena. So I'm just presenting it as kind of a theory that some parapsychologists have, which is equally amazing, don't get me wrong, equally amazing if true and if there's proof of it. The third area of study, though, in parapsychology is after-death communication, like I said, which could also be referred to as survival research. Do we survive after death? And the two main areas of study in that are hauntings and mediumship. And it's the hauntings part I'd like to focus on. And the reason why is because parapsychologists within the world today will be looking at a number of those different areas, ESP, PK, or after-death communication. And, you know, we may be dealing with 300-400 parapsychologists in the world today. Not sure of the exact estimate, maybe a little bit less than that, at least qualified to PhD level. And I would say the majority would be looking at ESP and PK. There are a small number of us that are interested in haunting research. And a lot of people ask me why I'm interested in this at all. As a psychologist by training, an applied psychologist, but also an investigative and forensic psychologist, why am I interested in studying the paranormal at all, and why am I specifically interested in ghosts? And I could give you a long convoluted answer that's very technical and talks about Jung's writings on synchronicity and the paranormal, etc. But actually the reality of it is that I became interested in this because of a number of different influences, including Arthur C. Clarke, but ultimately as a 13-year-old watching this film, Ghostbusters. So because of that, I did fancy myself as a Dr. Peter Venkman type character and really wanted to get involved in parapsychology and the scientific study of it, but also at my heart, I am a Ghostbuster. Or I should say ghost hunter, because you don't find people going out and looking into ghosts on any given weekend describing themselves as a Ghostbuster. But certainly I had boyhood yearnings to have my own proton pack and various other equipment. So I'm grateful that I've got this career as a parapsychologist, but the distinction is that parapsychology is largely in the laboratory, studying phenomena in a lab-based setting, typically within a university. The ghost hunting side of things is going out into the field, into haunted houses and ghost hunting. And there are different motivations, different approaches that people take. From my perspective, it's about being in an environment where you're able to witness people's experiences. And it kind of gives the impetus and the observation that I need to then be able to go back to the lab and think about how can we test various theories. Related to that, you can see Dr. Venkman there, testing in his lab with cards. So what I'd like to do, as I do with any public speaking, is just see if there are any psychics amongst you. So what I'd like to do is ask you to think of one of these 6 cards. Okay, so clear your mind. I'm going to present you with 6 cards and I'd like you to think just of one of them. So you've got your focus, you've got one of those 6 cards. Okay, so hopefully this could be an example of precognition. We'll see, where instead of the 6 cards, I'm now going to show you 5 of them. I'm going to remove 1. If I've removed your card, then virtually put up your hand in the chat room, or drop me an email and we can see about testing you in the lab. And here's the 5. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to get an influx of emails because hopefully none of your cards are there. The thing is it an example of precognition? Is there some of the paranormal ability going on there? What's going on effectively? Well, it's a simple little psychology trick, change blindness. You're focused on the task that you actually don't see the fact that I've removed all of the cards completely. So the 5 that I've shown you there are completely different. And the way of easily illustrating that is if I show you the 6 again, pick any 2 or 3, but don't pick the original one you chose. Any 2 or 3, and then these are the 5 cards, and you'll see that they're all completely different. Okay, so it's a change blindness thing. Why am I even talking about that? A little trick, interesting trick to kind of show you or give you a nice introduction to a paranormal ability, but actually it's quite important when we're thinking about haunting experiences, because the idea of change blindness in a psychology context is being focused on a task and ignoring all the information around it. So focused on it. So there's an element of that in terms of haunting experiences when I start talking about them. So my focus as a parapsychologist is on haunting experiences. I've done lots of other research, but certainly this is the area that I'm particularly interested in. And as a starting point, I think it's quite useful to define haunting experiences. And a colleague of mine, Ian Baker, that actually used to be based up at Edinburgh University, part of the Kersler unit of parapsychology, where Caroline Watt and others are still based. He's now based at Derby, and he came up with this definition, which I think is a lovely one for haunting experiences: a sensory experience in which there appears to be present a person or animal, deceased or living, who is in fact out of sensory range of the experient. A kind of lovely definition that basically encapsulates this idea that a haunting experience doesn't just have to be seeing a figure, seeing an apparition. It can also be sense of presence, it can be hearing, it can be a touch sensation, a taste sensation, any kind of sensory experience. And I think that's a lovely way to define haunting experiences. So in talking about haunting experiences, what I wanted to do is kind of talk about it in relation to a new book that's coming out that I've been working on for a while now with a number of individuals. It's called Ghosted. I realise that the definition of ghosted actually means something else to do with relationships. However, it's Ghosted, and it's exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. And effectively, James Horan and others, including myself, got together. We call ourselves the Global Ghost Gang of researchers with different perspectives. And effectively what we were doing was looking at, I don't know if you can actually see this. Yes, you can. So this is an anthology, Hauntings and Poltergeist, a multidisciplinary perspective. That was written about 20 years ago. And it was a unique academic anthology of ghosts. It was giving lots of different perspectives on ghosts and understanding ghosts. So it gave a psychological perspective, it gave a sociological perspective, it gave a perspective about electromagnetic fields, about even infrasound, phenomenology, so just understanding the impact on people, lots of different perspectives, multidisciplinary perspectives from 20 years ago. What we wanted to do was effectively conduct a new, almost next generation study of these phenomena that picked up where that original book left off. So it's published by the same people, McFarland. It's written for lay audiences, including amateur paranormal investigators and ghost hunters, but it's relaying the latest scientific insights and information on hauntings. The team of names that you see there, we've effectively been doing, well, all of us independently have been doing research on hauntings for a number of years. I've been involved in hauntings research now for 30 years as a parapsychologist, more so in the last 22 years. But collectively, we wanted to do research together that took all of our previous research, but then as a team worked together. And so for a period of about 3 or 4 years, We conducted research and published various articles. And then what we've done for this book is taken all of that stuff together, effectively almost about 20 peer-reviewed scientific articles, take all of that, but take the themes of it and the results of it and the insights from it and put it into one book. We're not replicating exactly the journal articles, don't get me wrong. This has got a nice narrative, it's easily readable, but also it is effectively concluding that ghosts should be taken seriously as a scientific topic. If anything, the experiences that people have, they tell us a lot about the living, but also about the dead. So there's really something there. And this is a perspective that I love, because on paranormal shows, I very much am wheeled out as the skeptic, the party pooper, but kind of kind of described or misrepresented as a cynic. A cynic means somebody who's closed-minded, and that's certainly not the case at all. I'm skeptical, which means I'm open-minded to the possibility, but I'm questioning the evidence. But also remember, I'm a parapsychologist and a ghost hunter at heart. So when I speak to colleagues about some of the research I do, some colleagues say, well, why are you wasting your time looking into people's haunting and ghostly experiences? Because effectively they're all deluded, or they're fraudulent, they're faking their stories. And that comes from a complete ignorance and misunderstanding of the sorts of experiences people have, but also complete misunderstanding that people are having these experiences regardless of background, educational background, socioeconomic background, culture, age, gender, etc. So it's wrong of us in the scientific community to ignore it, to understand it more. If anything, there's a responsibility, I think, to understand it. So this research group formed about 3 or 4 years ago, started looking at these studies, a program that was entirely data driven, looking at lots of different aspects, bringing in social and physical sciences, but also all of the team members, all PhD researchers, all represent different points along a paranormal belief spectrum. So it's almost an adversarial collaboration. And that's also reflected in who we've got, who has done the forward and the afterward, but also we have various testimonials. So we have Steve, the tech guy from Ghost Hunters, show Ghost Hunters. Brandon Alvis, for example, is another paranormal TV celeb who has done a testimonial for us. Both of these individuals had advanced copies of the books for them to read it and give testimonials. And we wanted to get perspectives that reflected the team's perspective, which is a whole range of perspectives. So what I'm going to do briefly is kind of highlight just certain aspects of the book. It's effectively using the book as a way of talking about my research and my interest in understanding the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. Big part of the book is reflecting the two areas that parapsychologists often look at, which is in trying to understand haunting experiences, we need to be aware of the role of the environment and the role of the mind. And the role of the environment can cover many different things: physical characteristics, geomagnetic or electromagnetic fields, temperature, infrasound, lots of different things. And part of talking about the environment, I'm quite lucky in publishing a study, Things That Go Bump in the Literature, an environmental appraisal of haunted houses, which is effectively a paper which was a narrative overview of the past 20 years of environmental research about anomalous experiences that are attributed to haunted house, but specifically looking at the role of the environment. So it's kind of an update from that original anthology over 20 years ago. But effectively what we showed was that there was a real paucity of studies. There just aren't the studies out there. Over 20 years, there have only been 66 studies looking at the role of the environment in haunting experiences, which for a 20-year period is actually very, very small. Also, what we found was the literature was diverse and it lacked methodological consistency, but also adherence to the prior suggestions in terms of what was happening in the studies. But there was a recurring focus on 6 key environmental aspects. So embedded static cues, lighting levels, air quality, temperature, infrasound, and electromagnetic fields. However, their relation to the onset or structure of witness reports showed mostly null, though sometimes inconsistent or weak outcomes. And to break all of that down simplistically is to effectively say, while some of these environmental variables, including those that I've got on the screen, are good suspects for explaining some haunting experiences, actually, if a scientific skeptic is wheeled out in a paranormal show to go, oh, that was an interesting experience, but infrasound could explain that, or electromagnetic fields could explain that. Actually, the purpose of our review, what we found, the conclusion is effectively saying, you know what? The research doesn't show that. The research, if we're being as skeptical about the scientific research as we are about people's experiences, then effectively what we're showing is that the literature is not clear and does not provide persuasive evidence for most of these environmental stimulants as a robust model for haunted houses. If anything, what we're effectively saying is these things are interesting. Science can't really guarantee that these things do explain haunting experiences. If anything, there's kind of a complex mix of explanations that could work here. One of my favorite, just as an aside, which I wanted to mention, one of my favorite environmental variables is infrasound, this idea of low frequency sound. If you take the low frequencies and compare with the human hearing threshold at higher frequency, so higher frequency there, you can see how kind of much less sensitive our hearing process is. And although it's thought that the whole body plays an important role in the perception of infrasound, remembering ultrasound is high end, infrasound is low end. And it's effectively, it's almost as though we can't hear it. We can't hear the noise, but the process is happening. And there are various studies that talk about it in terms of affecting our body, potential to resonate our body, certain body parts. You know, we can feel it physiologically. And there was some early research that was conducted in Coventry by Vic Tandy, proposing a link between infrasound, specifically 18.9 hertz, and haunting experiences. And I was fascinated by the idea, and I got involved in a research team very early on called Infrasonic or Soundless Music, with Sarah Anglis and colleagues at the National Physical Laboratory, in terms of a scientific art collaboration where we wanted to test this idea that this particular frequency that Vic Tandy proposed in a haunting context can genuinely affect people like the way he said. So given it was a scientific art collaboration, we had a concert that was set up in the Royal Festival Hall, and the National Physical Laboratory built an infrasound generator and blasted the audience with 18.9 hertz, and we measured the emotional response to the music. We had 2 concerts back to back, different audiences, but exactly the same program of music, and we played infrasound at different points in both of those concerts, but measured the emotional response in terms of people's response to emotion scales at the same points in each of the concerts to see if there was any effect. And what we found was that infrasound added to the intensity of an already existing experience. So people's emotional response to the music did not change, but the intensity of that emotional response changed, which is interesting when you start to think about it in a haunting context, which I'll come to in a second. And one of the impetus and one of the early aspects of that infrasonic research or soundless music research that we did for the Royal Festival Hall was visiting various cathedrals where there were infrasonic pipes that produced an infrasonic note. You can't hear the note, but you can feel it. And Sarah Angus, the leader of the project, asked organ builders why they put infrasonic pipes into organs, or modern organ builders, why they would put it in, or why there were infrasonic pipes in some of these old cathedral organs or church organs. And some of them said it was a way to up the bill. It just added a huge pipe and it kind of, it increased the bill. You could make some nice money from it. Others said it was to add a sense of profundity to the music. And it's interesting, if you get a chance, there are various cathedrals around the country where they have these huge church organs with an infrasonic pipe. St Albans is a very good example. And if they happen to be playing music, we were quite lucky when we visited St Albans that the church organist played some music and then played the same music but added the infrasonic pipe. Not very scientific, but standing in the church you could feel that infrasound physically on you. And so if effectively what we were starting to realize is that the effect of infrasound was contextual. In a religious setting, the infrasound gave you a profound experience, almost as though the sense of presence was religious, a sense of there being somebody omnipotent around you potentially. In a different context, in a haunting context, the infrasound could be attributed to spirit. So you would have the same sensation, but you'd be thinking, is there a spirit or a sense of presence here? The same way that in a concert setting where we did it, the effect of that infrasound on you increased the intensity of the emotional experience. And we did a similar sort of study, just again as an aside, several years later with a different set of artists, Ian and Jane, and various other collaborators. So there's Ian and Jane sitting there. This is Charles Poulet, who's the producer. Long-term collaborators, Parsons there as well, who aided with the infrasound aspect of it, and then the musician who composed the music for the concert, which was a chap called Jay Spaceman. Some of you might know, founded the group Spiritualized. But again, we had the Royal Festival Hall for the first set of concert with Infrasonic for Silent Sound, and Ian and Jane. We did a concert at St George's Hall, amazing location. And here you can see it was an orchestra, well actually a small orchestra that was producing, playing the music written by Jay Spaceman for the concert. And then these are the pipes. Lovely to have this photograph that Steve Parsons created and built these infrasonic pipes that were used in various other experiments, including Mary King's Close in Edinburgh, over a number of experiments that we did as part of Mary King's Close Ghost Fest a few years ago, where we played infrasound to people that were on the history tour as they walked around Mary King's Close, and then gave questionnaires to see if the infrasound created any experiences, anomalous or haunting experiences. What we found, similar to all of this research, is that infrasound added to the intensity of the experience. So the experience already existed. So people were having the same experience in where the infrasound wasn't playing, but when infrasound was playing, that experience was heightened, intensified. So effectively, that research conducted by Steve Parsons and myself was effectively refuting the idea that Vic Tandy came up with, that a specific frequency of infrasound would be responsible for causing people's haunting experiences. And certainly part of our review paper, which we discuss in greater detail in the book, says that Infrasound may be a contributor in some locations, but certainly it cannot be regarded as the cause of haunting experiences. And so just to reiterate that, the fascinating thing for me about this research is you rewind back to some of my public appearances, public lectures, but also TV. And I would have been very quick to say, oh, EMF is great evidence for that causing people's experiences, or infrasound is great evidence for that causing people's experiences. And the lovely thing about the review and some of these studies, it's actually saying, you know what, if you examine this evidence with a truly scientific eye, it does not show definitively that these environmental variables are causing these haunting experiences at all. Which is for me is a lovely finding. If anything, it's a cry out for a lot more research and a lot more standardized research. So that's the environment. The other aspect of what we look at in the book, but also what I look at in terms of my research into looking at haunting experiences generally, is the role of the mind. We can't disentangle belief from people's experiences, but also the idea of suggestion. Merely suggesting to somebody that a location is haunted gives you the possibility that they may have an experience and attribute it to the haunting simply down to that suggestion. Sending people into a haunted house, telling them it's a haunted house, or they has the appearance of a haunted house, and there's a drop in temperature, or a sudden drop in temperature, they may attribute that to the presence of something, as opposed to a similar experience in an office building, and you'd be looking for the open window. A very simplistic example, I recognize that, but it's a way of explaining suggestion. States of mind also play a factor as well. We recognize that certainly a lot of experiences happening at nighttime, happening when people are going to sleep or waking up from sleep. We need to bear in mind states of mind and how that can play a factor. But there's a little bit more there in terms of role of the mind, and in terms of translating some of this research into the book in terms of the role of the mind. We know from examining people's experiences, when they talk about experiencing a ghost, that it actually entails a structured and predictable narrative that involves subjective and objective anomalies. And that the narrative, the way it's structured, holds true regardless of a witness's age or gender. And also, quite interestingly, you can show that it stands out as different from narratives derived from conditions of pure imagination. So when people are just using their imagination to create, a pretend ghostly account. It also differs from the narratives of expectation. So kind of a created narrative of what they would expect if they were going into a haunted house, but it also, the narrative of people's true experiences differ from those of fraudulent narratives. And I think that's an interesting part to it, because effectively there's an element of that I could show colleagues and go, well, look, here you say everybody's having these experiences and it's all potentially fraudulent, but actually, at the end of the day, here's some interesting research that's effectively showing no, fraudulent accounts, the narratives, the way they're constructed, is actually different to people talking about what they feel are genuine experiences. But also there's an element of ghost reports not being random. From our research, they tend to occur to people with a particular psychological profile, which is quite a complex profile. So it's a combination of hypersensitivity to bodily fluctuations, but also environmental fluctuations, as well as a tendency to attribute ambiguous information to supernatural forces. So it's about interpreting that ambiguity. And it's stuff like that where you can kind of understand why it needed an adversarial collaboration, because you can see some of our voices coming through on particular chapters, especially where we have an argument about there being, all people that have haunting experiences are those that attribute ambiguous information to supernatural forces. And so what you get coming through the book and coming through our research is each of our perspectives on this interpreting the data effectively. But also what we found, and that paper that I've got on the screen highlights that. That's a paper, and a lot of these are available free, the original scientific papers, and I'll put a link at the end. We also found that the same set of subjective and objective anomalies that define ghost narratives are found in other contexts. So, for example, preliminary research hints that children who report imaginary companions or friends sometimes reference creepy themes and experiences that mirror apparitions and haunted houses. But also we've got a number of studies that suggest that accounts of so-called group or gang stalking, which is also referred to or known as satellite terrorism, have the same narrative structure and contents as hauntings. And if you're not aware, gang stalking or satellite terrorism refers to people who report experiences of being monitored and stalked over time by a mysterious group of people for unknown reasons. And that particular paper, the John Hall paper, was a paper that I led on, analysing the accounts of people that claim they are gang stalked and analysing them for the features that we have potentially in ghost narratives. So it's the same sort of kind of traditional themes that we see coming through in both of those encounters, which is why at various points we discussed, do we want to call the book Exploring the Haunting Reality of Ghostly Encounters? But actually the more research we did, it was effectively saying, no, it's about the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. If anything, you could almost use the term entity encounters as well, because there's a lot of similarities there with alien encounters and that sort of thing. And just to kind of give a little caveat, it's not new to come up with this idea that people's experiences within the paranormal world, there potentially is a common theme between them. That's not a new idea. What we're effectively saying is, well, look, here's our analysis of all of these accounts, if anything, to show support for that idea, which we then publish in the book. But the role of the mind I find fascinating, and I have found fascinating for many, many years since I was involved in ghost hunting, even as a teenage boy. I was lucky enough to be involved in a study with colleagues from Hertfordshire and also from Edinburgh, where we looked at Hampton Court Palace, but also we looked at the Southbridge Vaults in Edinburgh, and a team led by Richard Wiseman, and it was looking at the psychological mechanisms that underlie ghostly activity, with Hampton Court Palace being a specific focus in terms of suggestion. But there's an area of Hampton Court Palace which is called the Haunted Gallery. And what we felt was that maybe what was going on in terms of the Haunted Gallery, which I think, looking at the map, I think it's that area there. Yes, I think it's probably that line there. That's the Great Hall, so it comes off the Great Hall there. So Haunted Gallery, feeling as though there's a huge suggestion element that could explain people's experiences. When they go into Hampton Court Palace and go up a set of amazing stairs into the Haunted Gallery, it's no surprise that they have these sorts of experiences, when in fact what we found was that there were significantly more reports of unusual experiences in areas that had a reputation for being haunted. But actually, whilst we expected the effect to be due to suggestion, the effect was not related to participants' prior knowledge about the reputation of these areas. And so that for me was an interesting finding. There were some interesting environmental aspects of that series of studies as well, which kind of we talk about in our review and kind of support some of the idea of environmental variables. But yeah, I think it was just an interesting contribution to understanding the role of the mind in haunting experiences, but also to an extent refuting the idea that suggestion could be that powerful enough to cause the experiences, specifically in this location, Hampton Court Palace. So yeah, interesting study, and a hard life as well, as a lowly PhD student over 20 years ago, being asked to live in Hampton Court Palace for 2 weeks. Very, very tough life. Quick nod to Mary King's Close as well. I mentioned about, a series of studies that are conducted there in terms of looking at infrasound, but also the role of the mind. And I mentioned that as well as doing studies in various other locations. I mentioned that because of where the society is based. So a particular favourite location of mine is Mary King's Close. Other aspects we talk about in the book include paraethics, which is a big bugbear of mine. Whilst there's ethical considerations for public ghost hunts, actually paraethics is more about the investigation of private residences, when individuals living in houses report ghostly experiences. And my concern is that a lot of those experiences are investigated by amateur groups that have no understanding of ethics. So we're able to use the opportunity in the book to provide some information about my research on ethics, guidelines that I published on ethics, but also signpost people to various organizations that themselves have published ethical guidelines, including the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, and ASAP, the Association for Scientific Studies of Anomalous Phenomena. So again, that's effectively showing you this is a particular theme of research that I'm fascinated by, but in doing a team-led book, you're able to provide your perspective on things, and paraethics is my particular perspective. We also have a little pop of paranormal television, but effectively saying, don't copy what you see. And I've got some screenshots there just so that I can show quite amusingly that I'm equally guilty of being involved in some of these shows and people wanting to copy what I do, whether it's being involved in a show like Ghost Adventures or Most Haunted. But at the end of the day, if it wasn't for some of these paranormal shows, then I wouldn't be giving this talk now, and I wouldn't be in a position to be able to produce more popular articles or popular books. So whilst it has its failings, I'm also very grateful for the opportunity. It's also given me the opportunity to do research at some amazing locations, including some of these, which I'm going to whiz through, which I just think are fantastic, amazing locations. Hellfire Caves previously, and this castle in Romania, and Eastern State Penitentiary, and Oxford Castle as well. So that's kind of briefly summarizing some of the highlights of exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters, but with a particular leaning towards explaining in the context of this new book, which I'm particularly excited about. Some of my future projects, including writing a book on paraethics, because I think it needs it, and crusading about paraethics. I'm also doing a lot of research on poltergeist phenomena at the moment, hence the photograph in the bottom left there of the Enfield poltergeist, and also doing research on demonic possession. I'm currently doing a theme of research with a neurologist in the States looking at a particular neurological disorder which could be a very good candidate for a lot of more extreme demonic possession cases. So look out for that. But also I'm particularly fascinated by lab tech and the use of virtual reality in understanding haunting experiences generally. And if any of you listened to the Battersea Poltergeist earlier this year, which I was involved in, then you'll know that I was able to take Danny Robbins, who is the presenter of Battersea Poltergeist, into a virtual reality environment and look at the power of that in terms of affecting him in such a way. And in fact, I think, let me just check. Yeah, I think I could do that. Indulge me for a second. I'm going to play you the video clip of Danny when I put him through virtual reality, just to kind of give you a neat summary of some of the VR haunting studies that I'm doing. So hopefully, let me know in the chat that you can hear okay, but I'm going to play this now, just a couple of minutes long.
Fear is the strongest of all emotions. It's what's kept us alive for millions of years, saved us from predators. And now I'm going to do an experiment.
Oh. Working fine. Working fine until I stopped it. Here we go.
Experiment to show you the power of fear. Is that scary? Does that feel scary? Yeah.
You can never underestimate fear. The power of fear on our mental health, our well-being, but also specifically our own body and what it can do to our body.
Can fear actually create a haunting?
It's not a huge leap to say that fear could actually make you think that an object is moving of its own accord. So I brought you here for this fear experiment, and what's going to happen is a number of different stages. So first of all, we need to get your consent that you're happy to be put into a fearful environment. And then we've got some pre-tests that we want you to do. Once you've done that, hook you up to physiological measuring equipment.
One thing is troubling me, Ciaran. On the wall, there's a little blue plastic box that has written on it, urine and vomit spill kit.
Some people do have adverse reactions to the VR. We're then going to put you into the virtual reality environment. You're going to be walking through a haunted house.
Oh God, it's totally dark. Oh, what was that? Oh! Oh! Whoa, 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 whoa. Ah! What was that? Oh my God, there is a lantern floating in the air. Whoa, where is he now? Whoa! What the hell is that? Oh God. God, I'm feeling shivers down my spine there. Ah! Ah! After 10 more minutes of me basically screaming, Lynn rescues me. Ciaran leads me through another door in the lab.
What I'd like you to do is you're going to stay in this room for about 10-15 minutes. Just reflect on the experience you've had anyway in the VR. Just look out for anything.
Ciaran closes the door, leaving me alone in the room.
You have that anticipation that I might be doing something. You've got fear. Everything starts to be elevated. You're starting to get nervous and anxious about the environment. So imagine, for example, a cup falling off a table or an object falling, something like that. But in that state of mind, with fear playing havoc with you, that then turns into, I think that cup just flew off the table.
Fear.
So there you go. That's Battersea Poltergeist, but that was the virtual reality study, just a little study that I did with Danny, but it's a whole series of studies I'm doing looking at the physiological response to fearful settings and the power of fear and how it can affect you in particular ways. And it's one of a theme of research using VR and various physiological measuring equipment. The other thing, just to finish, that I do online courses. So here's a web address for some of my online courses. Courses on exorcism and possession, investigating poltergeist, foundations, various parapsychology courses as well. So feel free to check that out. And that's it. It just leaves me to say thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to take any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Ciaran. Very, very interesting talk there. As Ciaran's just said, he's happy to take any questions. So if anyone's got any questions, you can either unmute yourself or you can post your question in the chat and we can take it from there. Pause to see if anything
Or
happens.
not, I've just stunned everybody, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I should have said, actually, let me reshare the bottom of that screen, the last slide as well. The reason why I'm just sharing that again is because obviously it's got the school link there, but ResearchGate. So my book will be available through here for pre-order. It's also available for pre-order through Amazon and McFarlane. But if that's not what you want, but the research interests you, then please do just go to researchgate.org researchgate.net. And when you go there, just type in my name and you can find my ResearchGate page. And I make publicly available all of my research articles. And if for any reason, any of the research articles that I've talked about, having done within the last 3 to 4, and even older than that, but 3 to 4 years, if any of them are not available on that page, there will always be a button that says request text or request the article, because some of them have copyright restrictions on them. But it does mean that I can just send it to you privately. So if you are interested in the research, you don't have to buy the book. I'm doing myself out of royalties there, but you don't have to buy the book, but you can always go to researchgate.net and find any of my research articles there too.
Cool. I'll put the URLs that you've mentioned, I'll put them on the Edinburgh Fortean Society webpage, and for those watching on YouTube, I'll put them in the description below as well, so anyone can get them from there and can follow them all up, as well as all the details about Ciaran's latest book as well.
Fab. Thank you.
Not seeing anyone wanting to ask a question. Anyone wanting to raise a hand? I'll go with one. I'll go with one if I may.
Also, what I'm doing is typing into the chat room my university email address, so that if anybody doesn't want to ask a question here, or they suddenly remember a question they want to ask, please do just copy down that email address and feel free to drop me an email. That's not a problem.
Cool. Thanks for that. What's the most amazing thing that's made you think that you've ever seen as you've been doing this sort of work and research?
That's a tough question, because there's two answers. One is the personal answer, as in anything that I've privately witnessed, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing is amazing stuff in the paranormal that makes me think, or that I find fascinating, and it would have to be the poltergeist cases. So it'd have to be Enfield, which I still debate now with students on a regular basis and colleagues now in terms of that one, but also more recently the Battersea Poltergeist. So both of those poltergeist cases, and there are others too. We're looking at a new one with Danny, a case again that's not so well known. Once you start to look into some of these poltergeist cases, the amount and frequency of phenomena that you're dealing with, it's too simple an explanation to say that person faked it, that one person faked it, especially where you have multiple independent witnesses witnessing the same thing. So it's looking more into those, and being in a lovely position to be able to interview some of the witnesses in those cases, I think has really created head-scratching moments. From a personal perspective, there have been a couple of incidents. So haunted nightclub in Birkenhead, where myself and the Parascience team caught on a thermal imager what can only be described as a fog approaching a seance table, as the people around the seance table started to refer to a build-up of energy. So they were talking about a build-up of energy as this kind of fog of effectively a low temperature was surrounding them. And then, as they said, the energy seemed to dissipate. This low temperature fog just kind of dissipated away from the table. Now, their interpretation of that drop in temperature as energy is fascinating anyway, just fascinating. But actually, the low temperature fog is an anomaly. Still can't explain it to that day. So that would definitely be one of those occasions that has made me think. A head-scratching moment, I think, is a lovely way to describe it.
That's brilliant. Cool. And we've also got a question in the chat, and Stu Smith has raised his hand. The question in the chat came through first, so I'll read that one out. This is from Freya. I find the concept of para-ethics really interesting. There must be a lot to it as you're writing a book on it, but could you talk a bit more about it and what you think the most important elements are?
That's a great question, Freya, and I think one of the most important elements for those that understand ethics generally, when you're dealing with human participants, you'll understand this, is that at its absolute basic level, ethics when you're dealing with people is ensuring that when you encounter them, that when you leave them, you are leaving them in the same, if not better state than when they were before you met them. And that's key when you're thinking about ghost hunting and working with private residences. If somebody reports a haunting experiences in their home and you as an individual, as a group go in, after your investigation or interaction with them, are you leaving them in the same state or better than how they were before? If you're leaving them in a worse state, you know, that's ethics just out the window. There's something wrong there. So that's kind of a fundamental aspect of ethics and ethical research with human participants. The other important elements are, and there are, I think all of them are important, but some of the key ones are around expertise. You know, you need to recognize your own limits when it comes to expertise. The classic example is in Ghostbusters, where they're interviewing the librarian in the opening of the film and they start asking about medication and mental health diagnosis. You know, too often I see amateur ghost hunters asking very similar questions, and you kind of go, well, where is your expertise in understanding the answer? You know, so that's fundamental to ethics. And there are lots. You know, I could go on, I could give a completely separate talk just about ethics, but there is a lot to write about it, both in terms of explaining all of ethics itself, explaining how to ethically interview people, explaining about boundaries and expertise, about power dynamics, about what an overnight investigation could do in terms of a negative psychological impact on the witness, all of those things. But then also within the book, I'm writing about various case studies that myself and colleagues have been involved in, where we have played mop up, where we've gone into cases and we have had to mop up a situation where somebody has been unethically treated. You know, and there are many, and I just think I've been talking about it for years, and I know lots of colleagues in various organizations are also very keen to promote it. And whilst we have a few headlines here and there about ghost hunters, you know, trespassing on private property or causing vandalism, I think it's just around the corner that we're going to get an absolutely awful headline of some incredibly unethical behavior. I think it's just waiting to happen until we wake up, you know, to the reality that ghost hunters and amateur ghost hunters, when dealing with private cases, you need to be ethical. End of.
Excellent. Some very important words there. I suspect you're right, and you know, yourself and organisations you mentioned, such as SPR and ASAP and Steve Parsons and people like that, are really trying to push this. But there are so many people who just watch Ghostbusters and think that's a training manual and go out and do it, and as you say, potentially do a hell of a lot more harm than good. So
yeah.
Thank you for that, Steve. Sorry. Thank you for that. Sorry about that. Thank you for that, Ciaran, and thank you for the question there, Freya. Stu, you had a question next, I believe?
Yeah, so I think the paraethics stuff is really good and interesting, and thanks for the rest of the talk and everything like that. Yeah, I mean, I guess you were very happy with the way that worked on the Battersea Poltergeist. Did you have input on that? The only thing that kind of I was a bit worried about how Shirley was at the end of it, with the sort of things with the graphologist and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, was she all happy at the end of it?
Oh yes, 100% she was happy, but also there was very much a duty of care with Shirley from day one. So duty of care started with Shirley about 18 months, if not 2 years prior to when you heard the Battersea Poltergeist podcast. And that duty of care came from Danny, but you know, also to an extent, Evelyn and myself were also asking about Shirley and how she was doing. And since the podcast finished, the moment it finished, Evelyn and myself have both been in touch with Shirley independently and just made sure she's all right. And actually, she's loving it. You know, she made it very clear, and she had a discussion with Danny very early on, that if you were to go back even maybe 5 or 6 years, kind of resurfacing or reigniting the interest in Battersea Poltergeist and talking about it again would have been the wrong time for her. She wasn't ready even then, you know, in kind of the recent history. But a couple of years ago, she was ready to talk about it again, and quite happy to talk about it again and revisit it. And you see in Shirley somebody who is very confident, very genuine, very matter of fact about her experiences, and is not afraid to say on air, Ciaran, you're wrong. She does in one of the final episodes, which is a lovely moment that Shirley and I both laughed about together. So she has that confidence to be able to do that. And I think that speaks volumes in terms of, you know, some of the interpretations that the graphologist had, and, you know, some of the other perspectives. But it's also testament to the duty of care and the support that Danny and others have provided, that it hasn't stopped since the podcast has finished, because the attention has not stopped. So there's been very much a duty of care and support to ensure that Shirley is not hounded like she was back in 1956, you know, especially from some of the gutter press that may be pointing the finger and effectively using the fraud finger, which they did back in 1956. So it's a really good point, Stu, but actually Shirley is more than happy to have the discussion again about Battersea Poltergeist, and she always has the argument to people like myself and the graphologists and others, and just go, you weren't there.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
No problem.
For those who aren't familiar with the Battersea Poltergeist, it's still available on the BBC Sounds app. There is a book available on it, and Ciaran wrote an excellent article on it 3 issues ago in Fortean Times, something
Yes.
like that, I think it was.
Yeah. I was quite. I was privileged actually to write for FT. I've always been a follower of FT and Forteana generally, but yeah, it was the first time I've actually written FT, even though I've had the magazine and read the magazine since a teenager. So a lovely debut. But it was a lot of back and forth, because one of the requests was to do a timeline of the phenomena that happened in the Battersea Poltergeist, and my first attempt at the timeline ran into about 15 or 16 pages, because it is across 12 pages. But yeah, the editor turned around and said, I think we're going to have to try and reduce it. If you can reduce it to under 5, we'll be happy. And I managed it in the end. So yeah, I'm very proud of that article.
Excellent. It's a good article, definitely. So for anyone who hasn't read it, try and seek that out. Back issues are available from the publishers, no problem. Has anybody got any more questions? Stu's just said that was an immense bit of work, even cut down, or maybe more to cut down.
Yeah.
Is the full 15-page version available anywhere, Ciaran?
And not available anywhere in terms of published, but as some people may know, there is a Battersea Poltergeist live, kind of a 9-date theatre show where they're transferring some of the podcast onto the stage, which incorporates some drama, but also new witnesses, some new evidence that's come through. And so as part of that, the timeline may well show itself in some publication or as part of that theatre show.
Excellent. That would be good to read the whole thing there. Thanks for that. Stuart.
Sorry, it's Anne here.
Sorry,
Hi,
Anne.
it's Suzanne.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. You can't help the image. Thank you, Ciaran. That's an absolutely fascinating talk, and you've given us an awful lot to read up about and follow up on. So that was brilliant. I just wondered, I guess following on from Gordon's question, have you ever come across any kind of paranormal experience during the course of your research that you found so seriously disturbing that you made you question your career path?
Very, very good. Very, very good question. Thank you for that, Anne. Thank you for the positive comments as well about the talk. Has there been a question my career path? No. There have been some extreme experiences that I've witnessed. There have been experiences that I've witnessed involving my wife, in terms of her experiences in a haunted environment and seeing how she reacts. Specifically, there was a Second World War Nazi bunker on the island of Guernsey, and there's a particular location that she's horrified by, and there's an interview that I did with her for a YouTube series, Ghostlands, that the two of us put together, and I interviewed her for that, and she's visibly shaken by the location, but also when we were scouting out that location, she sat outside because she was so horrified by it. And I went into the location, the deep dark depths of this bunker, by myself and just a camera and no torch, which I was happy to do, and walked around. And at some point I heard her shouting out my name, and I ran back, and it took me about 2-3 minutes to run back to the outside to where she was, because it's kind of a vast network, this particular bunker. When I got back, she was visibly shaken, and she retells the story of her that she was sitting outside in the sun, not wanting to go inside. It's a locked bunker, so we were the ones with the keys. There was nobody inside, nobody could get inside. And at some point she heard, she described as my feet, the footsteps of my feet coming back to her. So the footsteps coming back to her and then stopping, and then her saying, Ciaran, Ciaran, and then the footsteps shuffling, and that's it. And then her looking around the corner, and there was nobody there. And then that's when she shouted out for me, scared as anything. And then I come running back, and it's seeing the genuine reaction of a loved one to something quite scary. You know, you can see that genuine reaction. And that would be an example of an extreme experience that you're talking about. But it has never made me question my career path. If anything, it's given more fuel to the fire in terms of wanting to continue to understand these experiences. If anything, experiences like that, and experiences that I've witnessed of other people, and the odd one or two experiences that I've had that haven't been so extreme but kind of minor things, if anything, it's those experiences that make you as a parapsychologist or a scientist more sympathetic to people's experiences. I would say that parapsychologists as a field, parapsychologists need to get out into the field a lot more, because you rewind 25, 30 years ago, and a lot of parapsychologists would actually be quite dismissive of people's experiences and just go, well, you know, that's happening out of the field, we can't control it, we're in the lab, there's lots of alternative explanations for what's going on. But until you've seen a lot of, you know, people have these experiences and recount these experiences time and time again, and see them visibly shaken by them, you can't really be sympathetic about those experiences, and you can't, you know, really get almost empathic about it as well if you've had similar experiences, but you can't be sympathetic about it, and you can't really understand those experiences. So no, Anne, there's nothing that has made me change my career path. If anything, it's made me more motivated to try and find answers.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, from your description, it really kind of emphasises the essential importance of empathy and respect for the participant, and it goes back to the whole point you're making about the centrality of ethics for the researcher. So absolutely. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Anne.
Has anyone else got a question they'd like to ask? If so, please type, raise your hand. Oh, Emily, we've got a hand raised from Emily. If you just unmute yourself, please, Emily.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, Emily.
It's actually Laura. So
hi, Laura.
I was just wondering, actually, we've been watching the second series of Hellier again, and
yes.
Did I see your name credited as a thank you for like some kind of advice or something in the end there? And if so, what your involvement was with the TV series and what you think is actually happening with all of that?
How funny. Yeah, I think it's maybe kind of a thank you credit more than anything else, because of when Hellier Series 1 came out. And I very quickly recognised that here was a series, first of all, it's a series produced by a group but actually the quality of it is amazing. So in terms of the production side of it is absolutely phenomenal. But then also some of the themes that they're exploring, specifically around synchronicity, and also their kind of attempts at Gunsfeld type research as well, but looking at lots of different Fortean type subjects, goblins and hauntings, synchronicity, alien abduction, etc. That first series had such an impact on me that I run a module at the university called Exceptional Human Experiences, and I made that series 1, compulsory viewing for the students. And it was that and the very public shout out that I was doing to Greg and Dana and the rest of the team to effectively say, look, you know, if you watch this, you get a lot of themes explored that, you know, very quickly can draw you into reading about lots of different subjects, more than I think any other series has been able to do. So if you watch something like that, it means you start to read some of Jacques Vallée's work. You read some of the Mothman prophecy, you know, the Mothman prophecies. You read about that. You read about goblins. You read about hauntings, that sort of stuff. And I think it was more their gratitude might be in terms of the presentation I did for Phenomenacon, but also because of the public recognition of the influence and the impact that a series like that can have on the viewing public in making them read more. And you know, there's a lot of references to books, so I'm very grateful. I didn't realize there was that public thank you. I've watched the whole thing but didn't notice that in the credits, but I think that's where it's from. I certainly wasn't a consultant on the show. I wasn't a consultant, but I think it's that. And series 2 just takes it off in a wild direction that is equally fantastic. So yeah, so thank you for that, Laura. I'm a big fan.
I mean, we totally agree with it. I mean, everything, I mean, our bookshelf has just expanded twice over since we started watching it, and it definitely has a profound influence on the way we think about a lot of things, actually, and it's been really exciting. But yeah, if you look at on the very, very last one, just I think we were trying to figure out who was singing a song, which was why I was looking at the credits and your name came up, but it was spelt slightly differently. That's why I was like, is it you?
Right.
Can it not be you? But yeah, no,
yes,
thank you.
It was even the concept of ultra terrestrials too. They keep talking about ultra terrestrials is a lovely nod to a whole series of books, and yeah, just fascinating. So lovely to hear that your bookcase has expanded, or your bookshelves
Yeah, and
have
it
expanded.
seems like there's a whole universe of people that are kind of involved in that, which you can then dip into the podcasts and everything. So yeah, it's
Absolutely.
really great.
Brilliant.
Thank you very
Thank you for
much.
that. Thank you, Laura.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Ciaran, and thank you, Laura. Bethany, your hands up now, please.
Yeah, sorry. Can you see me? Yeah.
Hi, Beth.
Hello. No, I was just thinking, Ciaran, is there any research, like cross-cultural research, about different experiences? I'm thinking like there are probably like common ideas about demons, for example. I'm just making this up as I go along kind of thing, but just the way that people would react in thinking that they come into contact with such a entity.
Yes, absolutely. And there is a feature of that in the book,
Mhm.
in terms of entity encounters, and recognizing that there are some cultural studies, but also there are cultural commonalities between entity encounters, but also that you can find that potentially the same entity encounter, whilst it has commonalities, could actually be the same entity encounter, but in a different culture could be interpreted very differently. So in one culture, it might be interpreted as a haunting encounter or an apparitional encounter. In another culture, it might be interpreted as a tulpa, you know, or a thought form. In another culture, it might be interpreted, like you said, as a demon. In another culture, it might be an alien. So yeah, there is that sort of work. Once you start to do kind of a sweeping assessment of paranormal encounters generally, there's lots of interesting studies, you know, looking at those sorts of experiences across cultures. A lovely one, I think, is in near-death experiences. I can't remember his exact name. I think it's Thomas Keeler or Thomas Keller has written a lovely book, Near-Death Experiences, examining all of those experiences across a number of different cultures. So yeah, that's a good one to pick up.
Okay, I'll write that down. Thanks.
Thanks, Beth.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Emily or Laura, is that another hand up, or is it a legacy hand?
Legacy hand. There's an expression we didn't have 3 years ago, 2 years ago.
Sorry, I think legacy because I couldn't figure out how to do it in the first place. Now I suppose I've figured out how to undo it. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, I think that seems an appropriate moment to draw the evening to a close. We've had an excellent evening. We've heard a lot of different aspects of the paranormal, and I know I was scribbling things down as you were talking, a few books and papers for me to look out for, and definitely looking forward to Ghosted whenever it comes out. And you know, as expected, you know, it was a really great talk and very, very entertaining, very well put together, and you know, I knew that was going to be the case. So Ciaran, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time this evening, and you know, on behalf of everyone, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to seeing you and maybe the rest of the society in Edinburgh, hopefully very, very soon.
That would be excellent. Yeah, keep us posted, and we'll see what we can do. And we can all buy copies of your book off you when you come up as well and get them autographed.
Fabulous.
Always a bonus.
Lovely. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, Ciaran, and thank you everyone for coming. And remember, our talks continue. We've got one every month on the second Tuesday of every month, and the details are always online. If you just do a search for Edinburgh Fortean Society, you'll be able to find us. So thank you everyone, and thank you again, Ciaran. Thank you, folks. Good night.